ongoing recriminations among top political actors in Nigeria's last general election over their academic records and identity has raised the need for thorough background checks for those aspiring to hold political office in the country. Although certain agencies and political parties are empowered by law to carry out background checks on candidates they're sponsoring for elections and those to hold public offices, this task is rather carried out functionally in many instances. However, to prevent the stoking of tension and the polity currently being generated by the queries being raised over the academic records and identity of top politicians such as President Bola Tinubu and the first and second runners-up in the last presidential election, former Vice President Atiku Abubakar of the PDP and Mr. Peter Obi of the Labour Party will require thorough background checks in the future. Rights analyst Dr. Sam Amadi joins us now to discuss the need for electoral reforms, especially such as issues that are currently driving conversations around the outcome of the last presidential election. Dr. Amadi, it's good to have you with us as always.
Thank you for having me.
All right, I'll start just before we go into the issues of controversy of documents. There's been an increase in litigation determining the outcomes of perceived winners of elections and withdrawal of certificates of return. Is that indicative of flaws in our electoral system, you think?
Yes, I think it is indicative of flaws in the electoral regulatory legal regime, but also a cultural problem. It used to be said, I think it was the French philosopher Alexis Tocqueville, who says in the US, no sooner had there been a political crisis than it becomes legal crisis. One can say that there's too much a tendency to use the courts, often because of maybe court rules, procedures. The access to court in Nigeria is probably wider than it ought to be. There are little procedural checks in how cases proceed. So everybody goes to the court, and even for very unreasonable propositions. But then the electoral law and the procedure itself creates a lot of indeterminacies. So we need to deal with the electoral reform. The electoral system and the legal framework are sometimes vague, not definitive, and creates opportunity for opportunism for politicians and their lawyers to almost, in fact, sometimes they go to they climb up and down, Supreme Court, back to High Court, and so on. And then also the way regulatory agencies involved in elections manage their mandate. Oftentimes, this notion that they can't take definitive actions either to disqualify or to, kind of determine whether certain outcomes will happen. So take, for example, primaries. If you look at elections, some of them relate to failed primaries or non-primaries, but the Electoral Act gives INEC the power to supervise primaries. So I think there's INEC probably overwhelmed. They should probably break it up and leave some of the other non-electoral election matters, party registration, political education out of INEC, and then focus it on elections in a way that it knows that primary, it has to be there, provide the framework, report, and publish the report and say, this is what happened. So if there's greater clarity and authoritativeness in terms of decision-making before election, you will see less resort to litigation. And I think those are the two streams driving up the high level of litigation for election issues.
Now, Dr. Amadi, there's also been a lot of controversy over documents and identities of some politicians, and it's rather worrisome considering that they were screened, before they were deemed eligible to contest for the election. So how can this screening process be improved going forward?
First, I think there's a need for a reversal of electoral jurisprudence. I mean, you hear some courts say, oh, it doesn't matter, the certificate doesn't matter, what somebody has school cert, all kinds of things. They confuse the issue. So there's need to have authoritative statement by the Supreme Court that says, look, forgery of certificates should be a disqualification for everybody. So every court now takes a hint from there. Now, that will cascade down to party screening. Let's not forget that these candidates that now have issues around certification, we are first screened by the party. So usually the party screening, I've done primary myself as a candidate in a primary election twice. You provide everything. Now, there should be a process where the party first screens you, you provide the evidence so they can dictate it. If they fail to dictate it, the next level is INEC. INEC really caused this problem because if you look at the Electoral Act, it says INEC will announce candidates who are now qualified for election. It implies that INEC should be able to look at those certificates and then be able to say you make a wrong entry, fake, and then open it for public intervention. So we need to expand the period in which people begin to file in for candidacy. So for example, if you're going to have an election in August, you should, maybe by February, there's opening for those who want to vie for election at their party levels. They make public indications like they do in the US elsewhere. You file in and say, take affidavit, swear to the affidavit before you even go for primary. Now those documents are in public domain. INEC opens it up for everybody. So if you want to run for primary in APC or PDP, before even the primary holds, you do a filing to INEC, intention to contest election with all the required documents. Those are made public. Then individuals can verify, get back to INEC and say, these are fake results, whatever. So you have a period to review these certifications and filings before the primary, and the primary period is still also long enough before the election, so that before every election, these issues are resolved. If you watch the way these elections are done, oftentimes INEC will announce the final list of candidates maybe a few weeks or so to the main election. So I think there's need to have to review our schedule so that there's a formal process for indication to contest election, for primary even. And those procedures are uploaded for everybody. And the public can file in objections, indications of, and when there's a fraud trigger, INEC and the police now, INEC have to now refer it to proper either SSS or police investigation before it qualifies that candidate. Now, all this will have a window. When the window is shut, then it's shut. I think that's what we have to do. We have to take seriously the idea of vetting. You know, the way INEC proceeds and the parties proceed is like fait accompli. You know, well, it's about voting. People vote for you. It's not our job to dictate, no, let's go to the court. The court will determine whether you're fake. No, that's not the way to go because we are front-loading things that the regulatory agencies can manage to the courts. And by the time we get to the court gets trapped, too much to do, and the quality of decision-making becomes more, low level because they're struggling to cope with the schedule. So we need to reschedule our elections. At the same time, we need to reauthorize INEC and its agents and the police to do their vetting. And then the court must be very clear that forgery, certificate forgery, is a different category from qualification. If somebody is qualified for election but files in a fake certificate, they ought to be disqualified. Now, the implication of this really is that if you look at the level of forgery, universities, I used to be a university teacher. I know many people who complain about professors whose certificates are not, genuine. Maybe the entry certificate is not correct. If you look at civil service, we've seen lawyers who are later marked as not qualified. We have a virus of wrong certification, and it builds back into economic development, into democracy. And then, so we need to now take it as a national challenge to reduce the incidence of fraud and forgery in our national life. And the way to do it is after this electoral cycle. So sit back and reauthorize agencies and create a transparent process where people can petition, can object, and they have that process rigorously closed out. Not the one that you file the papers, INEC doesn't bother, police does not bother, DSS does not bother. Then after election, we come back to discuss pre-election issues because none of the systems did what they ought to do. So I think there's a need to revise the timeline to provide enough opportunity and a requirement of filing before you even go for primary. If you want to run an election, you have a time to file in your papers in a formal sense with all the certificates attached, and those will be made public for everybody. And then those who have objections will put in the objections, and the INEC will be under obligation to investigate. In fact, I wanted to go to court when we were talking about this, that INEC ought to investigate before even the APC special candidate files paper. There are all kinds of rumor. It's the job of the INEC to have stepped in, done the initial review, certify itself that these certificates are on the face of it proper, and move on. That may have diffused some of this tension. Sometimes people will say, okay, well, INEC has done the job, due diligence, well, no point. But no due diligence is done for anybody. Whatever filing is garbage in, garbage out. That is not what the law intends by giving INEC and the police and the security system the responsibility to manage this process.
Very good, Dr. Amadi. Now, how proactive is the judiciary and, of course, the legislature in the enactment and initiation of electoral reform over time? Because there has to be certain scenarios before they act. I'd like your thoughts on
Absolutely.
that.
Well, I think they delay a lot. I mean, by the time we got the 2022 election, the Electoral Act was very late. We almost have to coerce them to even introduce the so-called electronic transmission, and they introduce it in a very confusing manner. That's why the EU says the language, some vagueness, and now INEC has to use as excuse for failing in their responsibility. I think going forward, we should be able to, day one, after these cases, take up the issue of electoral reform seriously and close it out in about 6 months or 1 year, so that 2 years to election, the new laws are well known, debated. INEC would have produced guidelines based on clear understanding of that responsibility. I give an example. INEC and parties didn't even know that statutory delegates are no longer delegates until some of us started writing about it. And last minute, the parties got awakened to the fact that they had thought that 2022 Electoral Act kept the same party leaders as delegates, who said, no, all delegates must be elected delegates. So they were shocked. The same with the electoral transmission, device procedure that introduces the election. We need to have clarity on electoral laws. We need to have time to think through them properly. And we need to make them very clear and explicit so that INEC or any other person who is playing a role has no discretion to shift what they ought to do. It's be clear what they ought to do, and what they ought to do must be something that's doable, practicable, and there must be also, I think it's important, right now, nobody's talking about auditing INEC. INEC spent billions to introduce a device that it never intended to use. It says in this runoff election, the all-season elections in Imo, Kogi, and Bayelsa, INEC has come to say that we're going to use manual. So the question is, what is the business case that was made for you to invest so much billions to procure a platform that you're not using? So we're not asking the right question. We are getting tangled too much into the fight of who won, who didn't win. Thankfully, that gets done by end of November. We should get back to auditing INEC, asking questions around, does it have the capacity to even manage elections? It has failed many times. Is there something that needs to be changed about the entire structure? Do we get back to Uwe's report and the mode of appointing INEC officials, which Uwe's wants to be a competitive-based process, where those who emerge as INEC managers know that they are appointed by virtue of merit, not at the behest of politicians. These are critical issues we have to look at, because until we deal with the structural deficiencies that are now very manifest, we're going to have this same problem all over again. So I think that the sooner we close out the issue of who really won, who is qualified to be president or not, and then we zero in on institutional reform, deep one and radical ones, and then to finish it on time, to test run, so that all role occupants know exactly what the new law requires them to do. And then the National Assembly, the Auditor General, and all the oversight institutions should go into and ask, what did INEC do? Let's forget who they declared. How did they spend the money appropriated? Because those are issues of accountability that must happen to prepare us for the next election, to have a better election and stop all this waste of precious time that we should have invested in governance and development.
And Dr. Amadi, still talking about INEC, what role should the electoral body play in proving that an election is free and fair? Should the burden of proof be on the candidates or on INEC?
The good question. You see, the way Nigerian jurisprudence has gone, they have created an intricate structure around election. That's why election petition lawyers will tell you it's difficult for you to prove that you were rigged. It should be very simple. The onus is on, if somebody disputes an election which INEC conducted, INEC should have a responsibility and obligation to justify what they have done. And to a large extent before the burden shifts. So INEC has to show that they actually followed their rules, that they actually have the right result, and display it. Then the burden shifts to the person to prove that what INEC did is not up to the standard of law, or that the documents INEC has presented is not the right result. It's wrong to ask people to mold bricks from straw. Somebody goes to court to challenge INEC for electoral malpractice of whatever reason, and INEC refuses to bring the result, and you penalize the person because he didn't have agents, or his agents refuse to give them. That's total injustice. It doesn't stand to any jurisprudential idea of justice. The INEC is a public agency with responsibility. Look, this is important. The integrity of election doesn't depend on the candidates themselves. Even the candidates collude, even they all collude to cheat the voters, INEC has a responsibility to ensure that the elections are free and fair. Electoral free and fair election is not about the candidates, it's about the people, the citizens, who the Constitution has given the right to choose their leader. And so INEC should be seen as the regulator who has obligation and duty to justify what it has done. It shouldn't be the obligation of candidates, whether winner or loser, to justify what has been done. It's the INEC's responsibility to say, this is what we did. It measured to the requirement of the law, and what we did is credible. The results we declared is in line with what the voters did. And the court is satisfied and says, litigator or objector, we don't agree with you. You shouldn't ask people to go and produce results, and INEC that owns the result is not put on obligation to produce the result and justify their result. I mean, what we talked about in the Presidential Tribune, we talked about 18,000 results that were blank. INEC should produce the one that is not blank, because that is what it is. If you look at what happened in the US, where the Trump team is challenging some of the results, the state secretaries who conduct this election will go back, produce the computers, produce for the review audit session, produce the machines, and they go through it, and they will come and say, everything shows that this election were not manipulated. And those states will close out and say, they have a window, they have 30 days, they have 10 days, that window is for you to come and justify that everything went in order. Once it's done, the courts lock you out. That's how it should be. It's INEC that should show in any dispute, once there's a prima facie serious dispute, INEC should show that it did the right thing. And once INEC satisfies the court or the auditor that they have followed their rules and the outcome they declare is in accordance with the process and is credible and accurate, then the petitioner is foreclosed. It's not to ask the petitioner, when he has shown prima facie evidence, to now prove and show the real result. That's a reversal, and that's really the heart of the electoral injustice that our jurisprudence, not just for this case, has built over the years. And I think we need to have lawyers, scholars, and even political scientists sit together and review how judges make decisions regarding electoral equity. It has bearing on the growth of democracy or lack of it.
Indeed, Dr. Amadi. Now, we're having, I'd like you to take this briefly, we're having off-season polls in some states in November this year. What major cues will be needed to avoid some of the lapses that was witnessed in the general elections, in this instance?
I think the first thing INEC has to do is, for example, a place like Imo State, there's no basis to keep the rec. If all the 5 parties says we don't want this woman because of allegations, whether proven or otherwise, against their person in the last election, you just have to step that person down and bring college of national officers who are credible to run elections. Thank God it's only 3, Imo, Bayelsa, Kogi. You have to micro-zone on those places and look at what are those people who have been alleged against, officers who have terrible cases against them, take them out, bring other people for the election. 2, security. The report shows that everywhere security is used to either help to rig elections. So there's need now to be very clear, especially those who have commissioner of police who have been cited, they have to be put under a greater watch. Because why is it so? In Imo State, for example, insecurity is politically driven, more or less. So it's a national security interest to ensure that these elections do not further aggravate insecurity in places like Imo, Kogi, where you have already very, very bad security environment. And thirdly, I think this is very important. INEC should be very clear and open that they're going to use electronic transmission. These are small states. These are places that INEC can manage the internet connectivity, the system requirement. Because, you see, what this does for everybody is that for the polling unit, we just know the results. And it puts a lot of cost on those who would like to alter the election. To do manual and move from voting unit to allow security people to be used to manipulate elections. So let's try and give ourselves real-time result from polling units in all elections. It makes it easy. Everybody sees the election result, go into the server, the media can see it and call it, the civil society monitors can see the election. Let's demystify the whole idea about election as a secret court. It should be open, it should be immediate, and result known once counting has been done and verified.
Analyst Dr. Sam Amadi, thank you so much for joining us on Newsday.